Very good. Hope everyone's doing well. Have a nice weekend. Let's see. Any questions on what we covered last week on gifts, on finding stuff, on hunting stuff, on stealing stuff? Any questions? No questions? Okay. Today we are starting a new topic, and this is a topic that will probably take up the bulk of the rest of the semester. So far, we've done stuff that's been very intuitive. How to acquire property by hunting. How to acquire property by creating it. How to acquire property by discovering it. How to acquire property by finding it. How to acquire property by stealing it. The next, 4 or 5 weeks or so, will be premised not on acquiring property by taking or hunting it or stealing it, but through what we might call a transaction. Actually using a piece of paper and words to transfer a piece of land from one person to another. And this is the basis of what you probably thought property law was all about, and you think, why are we talking about hunting? Well, that's the easier stuff. I'll be very frank at the outset. The topics we'll be covering the next few weeks are not intuitive. They're not obvious like hunting is. The reason why they're not intuitive is because these rules were not developed by a group of really smart people sitting down in a room and deciding, here's how we're going to structure property law. Rather, our property system, even as it exists today, is the consequence of centuries, not years, centuries of historical developments. More so than any other topic you'll study in law school, except maybe constitutional law, property is a subject of history. And in order for you to understand how our system of property exists, even to this day, you need to understand how our system of property emerged since the Dark Ages. We're talking about 800-900 years. I know that sounds insane, but I hope by the end of this class you'll understand why feudalism and rules regarding serfs actually dictate much of what we have as property today. Okay, so any questions on that? So then my goal for today is we'll get to the readings were short, right? So, oh wow, it's 12 pages of reading, that's a piece of cake, right? There's some deep stuff in there. But my goal for today is to first sketch out for you the history of how our system of property laws has developed. And once you're actually able to grasp that history, we can then move on to what are called estates. And estates aren't what you thought they were. They're something else. But we'll discuss that in a few moments. Okay, so any questions before we get started? Okay. I'll probably be lecturing a little bit more than I usually do because this is more of historical nature, but I promise I'll be asking questions from you later on in the class. So the book leads off with a quote by a justice, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., one of the most revered justices, not in my opinion, but one of the most revered justices in the Supreme Court's history. And he once said something, it wasn't about property, but it may as well have been. He said, "It is revolting to have no better reason for a rule than that it was laid down in the time of Henry IV, which was around 1600s. It is still more revolting if the grounds upon which it was laid down have vanished long since, and the rule simply persists from imitation of the past." Our system of property is exactly what Holmes is talking about. It's an imitation of the past without much of a grounding in why. But it's not all bad. And I like that your book puts after the quotation from Holmes a passage from Benjamin Cardozo. Benjamin Cardozo was one of the great common law judges of the 20th century. Remember Palsgraf? He wrote that, yeah. He was the great common law judge of the 20th century in the New York Court of Appeals. He was later on the Supreme Court. He replaced Holmes. And what Cardozo wrote is no one person ever designed the property system from scratch. It would be impossible. It was built up over the course of centuries. And he actually quotes Holmes, of all people, who writes, "A page of history is worth a volume of logic." Think about that for a minute. A page of history is worth a volume of logic. To understand where we are today, you need to know where we were and must be mindful of this origin. Any questions on that? So our lesson today starts in the year 1066 with the Norman conquest, people wincing, grimacing. This is effectively when the English and the Norman or the French cultures merged, or nearly 1,000 years ago. It was the Norman conquest that gave rise to what we often call feudalism. Okay, feudalism. This is by the way, this is King William, or as many call him, William the Conqueror. He never actually conquered London, so they don't call him the Conqueror there. So this was King William. The purpose of feudalism was to create a hierarchy within society. Back in the Middle Ages, money wasn't really a thing yet. The measure of a person's wealth was in land. And that's an important concept to understand. People didn't pay rent to live on a piece of land. People didn't buy land. As it was understood in this pyramid, the king sat at the top. You know, Mel Brooks, it's good to be the king, right? The king sat at the top. And it was understood that the king owned all of the land in the realm. The king, that's why it's called a kingdom, right? The kingdom, it was a king's realm. He owned all the property in the land. But the king could not do everything by himself. He needed people beneath him to execute his orders, right? He needed lords to preside over specific areas. He needed knights, in shining armor who could go to fight. The king even needed people to farm, to till the land. The king needed priests to promote the church and promote the religion of the realm. Okay? The king needed a lot of different people to keep the kingdom chugging along. So this idea of this feudalism, this hierarchy pyramid, emerged. Rather than being able to pay any single subordinate money, instead, the king gave them a piece of land. What did a person have to do in order to earn that piece of land? He had to provide services. Okay? Because there was no money, the king provided land to the people beneath him, and in exchange, the people beneath him provided services. So this example, which I think was made for grade schoolers, but it works for law schools as well, illustrates it quite well. So you have the king at the top, right? And below the king, you have the nobles, or the lords, as you may want to call them. What did the king give to them? He gave them land. Lands were called fiefs. So if you look at the word fee simple, fee is short for fief. So he gave to them fiefs. Now, what did the nobles give to the king? Well, they did give some wealth. There was gold. That was a thing. But more importantly, they gave knights. The king's major mission back in those days was to wage war, right? England and France were perpetually at war for centuries, and every 5 minutes there was another war brewing up. The king needed men to fight in those battles. Okay? So the nobles would give knights. But wait a minute. How would the nobles have knights? Where would the nobles get these knights from? Well, the nobles would give land to the knights. That way you have these kind of like, not quite lords, but another rung in the ladder. And the knights in exchange would provide military service for the nobles, and if the king wants to fight a war, they would do so. Wait a minute, do you expect the knights, these people in these beautiful shining suits, to be farmers and to deal with dirty pigs and all this other stuff? No, no, no. So what the knights did was that, okay, hey, you guys, you peasants, you serfs, that's S-E-R-F, not S-U-R-F, you knights, you peasant, you serfs, we'll give you a small chunk of land, which you have to farm, and in exchange, you'll give us some of the food. And oh, by the way, the knights would give some of the crops and the nobles, and then the king had to eat, so the food went up there. Everyone see what's going on here. It was an entire economy premised on land. The entire economy was premised on giving land to people, and in exchange, they provide certain services. Everyone was subservient to everyone else, and at the top of the ladder, of course, was the king. Okay? Everyone is with me so far. So the book walks through a number of the different types of services. And I like this picture because it illustrates quite well the three major types of services. So the first major service was military. Knights provided men to fight in wars. There was the cleric, this little guy with the little friar hat on, right? The clerics were responsible for providing religious counseling. And then you see the guy with the shovel, right? This is the serf who provides the basic act of farming. The serfs were all at the bottom of the pyramid, and they effectively had no right to the land. Okay, they had no right to the land. They were on the land at the pleasure of their lord. If you've ever wondered where the phrase landlord came from, this is where it came from. The serfs were only on the land at the pleasure of the lord, the landlord. Okay? What would happen if one of the serfs didn't do what the lord told them? They get thrown off the land. Get thrown off the land. Now, back then, if you were getting thrown off the land you lived on, that was a death sentence because no other land would take you. You couldn't just move to another city. So there was a sense that you were only on the land so long as you provided the adequate services to your master. I have a couple of pictures here of how the manors were structured. And I like this diagram because you can see everything is chopped up into little slices. Each of these slices was actually a fief or a fee for a different serf. Imagine that. You and your family have this little, one of these little slivers of land, and that's what you're responsible for growing. And everything that you grow, you get to keep and give a percentage up to your master. This is also a nice representation of what the feudal manor looked like. There were separate fields. One of the innovations of feudalism was crop rotation. The idea that if you use a same piece of soil every year, you will overwork the soil and it'll become not very fruitful. So they would alternate first year, second year, and third year soils. They would even do, in this picture, autumn planting, spring planting, and you let one fallow. Fallow means you just let it sit empty and you let the soil regenerate. Here's another picture of the spring planting and the fall planting, and another picture of the manor. Okay. So all this sounds, fantastic. This elaborate system of how to use land in order to manage your economy. But over time, this simple, four-rung pyramid became very complicated, right? Why? Because what happens if, at first you have the king, and then say you have 5 lords and you have 10 knights. But then, one of the knights thinks, you know what? I don't want to be a knight anymore. I want to be a lord. So how am I going to become a lord? I'll tell you what. I'm going to find that other guy's a knight, and I'm going to stick him below me. Right? I'm going to insert another rung of knights below me. And that way, I don't have to deal with these stupid serfs. Let this guy deal with the peasants, right? Okay. Then another knight says, you know what? I don't want to deal with these peasants either. So let's insert another rung, right? So now you have 3 rungs of knights. And these lords say, ugh, I don't want to deal with these stupid knights anymore. They're always creaking around with their shiny suits. I want to be a lord. I will let someone else deal with these people. So you insert another rung. Okay. Over the course of centuries, this didn't happen overnight. Over the course of centuries, they kept adding more and more rungs to this ladder. And after a while, it became unclear who owed loyalty to whom. You didn't know who was actually on top. right? Because imagine one guy says, well, I'm below, Sir Arthur. Another guy says, no, I'm above Sir Galantin, right? You have all these people with competing claims to the same land, all of them demanding services. This was a process the book describes called sub-infeudation. Let me write that word for you. Sub-infeudation. If you're on Jeopardy, that'll be a clue for you. Sub-infeudation. Actually, there was in Jeopardy or something? I think it might have been. Yes, it was a Jeopardy clue. So the word mesne, right? M-E-S-N-E. Right? It means intermediary. That was actually a clue in Jeopardy a couple of years ago. And that was in your reading, so you may have this one day. But sub-infeudation was this process of inserting different rungs into the ladder. Okay? Perhaps the person who hated sub-infeudation the most was the king. Okay? Why did the king hate this the most? Because it made it harder for him to collect taxes. You see, the most important lesson of being the king is getting paid, right? The most important thing the king can do is ensure that his coffers have money and crops and gold flowing into them. This service going up, once that goes away, all these different rungs of conflicting hierarchies made it difficult for the king to be able to manage these different rungs. Okay? What also made these things difficult is very often the types of service going up became obsolete. Because what if someone promised, say, to plant, I don't know, wheat on the farm, and then over the years the soil became bad, and instead of planting wheat, the farm was most usable to raise livestock, to raise chickens and cows. His duty was to do something, raise wheat, that was no longer consistent. Okay? As a result, the king sought to eliminate this process of sub-infeudation. The king sought to eliminate this process of sub-infeudation. So in the year 1290, right, 800 years ago. So in the year 1290, the king enacted what's called the Statute Quia Emptoris. I swear this is going to be relevant, I promise. Statute Quia Emptoris. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong also. The Statute Quia Emptoris designed to get rid of sub-infeudation, right? To get rid of this complicated pyramid scheme where they kept adding different layers to the pyramid. Okay? That much is okay. But the king's goal, right? The king's goal was to try to keep the same land in the same families, and that way his duties would not become so complicated to enforce. Everyone get that, right? The goal was to keep the same land in the same families and keep everyone put, right? Don't have everyone moving around and making it complicated. But one thing you'll find about this class and the free market in general is that property likes to move. People don't like to stay in the same place forever. People like to be able to substitute and sell their land to others. And indeed, the remainder of this class, or at least this class today at least, is the king trying to make it harder to transfer land and smart lawyers finding ways around it. In fact, there was a 600-year battle between the King of England and lawyers. Yes, there were lawyers finding ways of bypassing the king's rules. I swear, almost everything we'll be studying this class and next was about avoiding taxes. You actually had lawyers trying to figure out ways of structuring transactions to avoid payment of duties and incidents and taxes. We've been doing this for a very long time, my friends. This is nothing new. So after the king enacted the Statute Quia Emptoris, the consequence was that now lawyers had to find different ways of transferring property. And actually, contrary to the king's intent, it became easier to transfer property. Because rather than having to focus on these complicated rungs of the ladder, that was gone. Now you could simply substitute party A for party B. right? Instead of having to try and fit, Knight Arthur under Knight Glanton, you could just transfer from Knight Arthur to Knight Glanton. It's actually a lot easier, a lot cleaner. This was not the king's intent, but the lawyers figured this out fairly quickly, over the course of centuries. But quick in the grand scheme of things. So now, instead of having this complicated pyramid scheme, people can now transfer from one to the other. This was the birth of what we would call today a real estate transaction, right? An actual transfer from A to B. This was really the birth of what we now call a market economy, right? It's perverse that the king's effort of stifling trade gave birth to market economies. The kings usually don't know what they're doing. So now people, I should say people. So now the non-serfs, the serfs were effectively considered slaves. They were bound to the land. They had no power whatsoever to do anything. However, the people, the knights and the lords, these people in the upper rungs, they can now move around. They can now actually sell land. Saying, you know what, I don't want to live here. I want to live on that manor. I don't want to grow this. I want to grow that. And they were able to freely move around. Okay? So everyone with me so far? If you have a question, stop me. I promise this history will make sense in a few more minutes. Okay. The next thing you have to understand, though, is that during the Middle Ages, virtually everyone was illiterate. People could not read. People could not write. Generally speaking, the only people who could read or write were the members of the church, right? They actually read the good book. There was no printing press yet, so they had to actually transcribe the Bible by hand. See these beautiful calligraphy Bibles in the old libraries. I mean, this is what they did. So as a consequence of the fact that people were illiterate, the common law, and I use this phrase broadly, the common law developed a very robust method of keeping track of property transactions. And we discussed this in class last week when we talked about the livery of Seisin. Okay? If I want to sell my property to you, you might say, well, write out a piece of paper. You say, Josh sells it to Joe on this and this date with this piece of land, but between these two trees, whatever, right? If you can't read, what tradition did the common law people create? Well, we watched the video last class. It's called the livery of Seisin. So imagine, right? You say, okay, I'll tell you what. You come to my farm. I take a clump of dirt. I put it in your hand. You give me a piece of gold. Okay? This is a witness act. Everyone sees it. I take a twig, right? Remember the twiggle? You twiggle the twig in the hand. This is actually a picture of the turf and twig ceremony. In fact, this is it's a representation of William Penn performing the act of Seisin with the Indians living in Delaware. You actually see him putting little. This never actually happened, I'm sure, but you can actually see the Indian twiggling his hand. Okay, and in fact, if you ever go to the statue of William Penn, and if you look at it closely, he has a little twig in his hand. William Penn was the founder of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And I showed you this video last week. But the reason why they did this act was to make it very easy to illiterate people to understand that there was actually a transfer of land. Like, what could be more clear than actually taking a clump of dirt and giving it to someone else, right? That's such a intuitive thing. Even a child would understand that act. And indeed, these people were not sophisticated. They didn't have a legal system. Now, what's interesting about the livery of Seisin, though, is if you do that once, people forget about it, right? Imagine a property stays in a family for hundreds of years. If 100 years ago some guy put some dirt in someone else's hand and twiggled it, will anyone remember? No. So what became known as livery of Seisin wasn't a one-time deal. It became an annual ritual, where every year, at a certain date, you'd be required to go to the woods. And the person who owned the property would take a clump of dirt and give it to the person who sold the property. And what happens if the original owner and the original seller were dead? Well, their children did it. And their grandchildren did it. And their great-grandchildren did it. So you see, even after the original buyer and seller are long dead, the tradition remains that every year you know that I am giving you this land because your great-grandfather sold it. And indeed, the book has a few interesting stories. There's actually a church, was in Connecticut or New York somewhere, from the 1770s, where they said every year you're required to give a certain amount of silver and a red rose in a ceremony. And to this day, every June, whatever it is, the owner of the church goes and gives a red rose to the descendants of the original grantors. The purpose of this was to always know that you're on this land with my permission. Now, today, if they forgot to give the red rose, it probably wouldn't be that big of a deal. But back in the medieval times, if someone forgot to hand over the red rose on the certain date, you know what would happen? They lose the land. They lose the land. Indeed, they did not have the notion that this is yours permanently. This was the service, the same way that the knights would provide service to the king and the serfs would provide service to the knights. This red rose took the place of the service. Think of it like a rent, right? You're paying a monthly rent. If you fail to pay the rent in a given month, you're evicted. So even today, we still have these traditions where every year you go out to the woods. Now, some of these became quite comical. There was the one, which I'm sure you chuckled at when you were reading it. What was it? It was the leap. I always forget what it is. Yes. There was one that says, once a year you have to deliver an eagle feather. And all together with, quote, a leap, a puff, and a fart. Yes, there were fart jokes back in Roman times. This was like a court gesture move where the king wants someone to make an ass of themselves, to use the expression, right? To make a fool of themselves, so that they remember that they're always loyal to the king at all junctures. You can see people said raunchy sense of humor, 800 years ago. Has not gone anywhere. Okay? I'm sorry?
I'm sorry. I was just saying my favorite part is they had to teach their kids how to do that for like 200 years.
Well, that's exactly the point. Because they did not have a system of recorded property interest, the only way you knew who owned what is by passing down family traditions. And in this case, they taught their kids and grandkids and great-grandkids how to leap, puff, and fart. The book puts it in there for a reason to illustrate how silly a lot of this stuff was. But this was their record-keeping system, because every year, okay, I have to go to the king's castle to fart. There's a thing that that the firstborn male now has this incumbent duty, right? That's why it's in there. Okay, so we now have this system where you can actually transfer land from A to B without this subinfeudation, without this sort of hierarchical pyramid. And in order to effect the transfer, in order to actually make the transfer of land, you use this process of livery of Seisin, where once a year, every 6 months, or whatever it happened to be, you have to deliver an eagle's feather, you have to deliver a chicken, you have to deliver a rose, you have to deliver a certain quantity of gold, right? This was a way of keeping track of who owned what. Yes, ma'am. Is it about the puffing and farting or no?
No. Actually, I'm trying to. When the king enacted key amateurs,
yes,
it was basically because he was been collecting the fees or the taxes for the land. It was just becoming more complicated because of all these new crimes.
Exactly.
How did the Twig and that the transaction, like being able to transfer the land, made it more easier for him?
Well, the king's intent was to make it harder to transfer land, right? But by eliminating this subinfeudation, he allowed people to simply sell it straight up with the twig and turf. The twig and turf became a consequence of no more subinfeudation, right? In the old days, you couldn't sell land. All you would do is insert like another rung in the ladder. But after these rungs were eliminated, now people, these were lawyers, right? Smart lawyers said, wait a minute, I can just substitute my place for someone else. Rather than putting them below me, we'll just swap places. We'll just substitute, which was allowed. So subinfeudation went away and was replaced by substitution. And the act of demonstrating the substitution was this twig and turf. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. But what was the king still like collecting? Was like this like.
Okay, So we'll discuss this next week. But the short answer is the king found a way to tax every single twig and turf ceremony. Okay. See, I'm telling you, this was like a 600-year battle between the kings and the lawyers. I'll get to in a second. So the king ultimately found a way of taxing each of these twig and turf ceremonies. So unsurprisingly, the lawyers found a way around this. And rather than having the twig and turf ceremony, they found ways of the property shifting from one person to the next without this ceremony. They found a way. Well, it's called a future interest. We discussed this briefly last class. I'll mention it. But the entirety of a future interest was saying, okay, I'm giving this to Josh today and Bill tomorrow, but it's only one transaction, and you only pay the tax once. That the entire idea of why we have future interest was meant as a method of tax evasion, right? This is long before Bernie Sanders, people were evading taxes, right? This is going for a very long, long time. Israel.
Okay. My question was with Livery Seisin, I think there's a lot of conflict as to the effect of the executive transfer and the act with people saying, you know, this person didn't do it or they didn't do it right.
Yeah.
They didn't do. So was it like a public affair? Like
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Let me show you this picture I showed before. But you were actually required to have witnesses at the ceremony, right? You actually have required to have witnesses. So what happens, you know, if it said you bring one red rose and someone says, wait a minute, there's a white rose, right? Well, then you have witnesses and you have courts. And indeed, thank you, it's a perfect segue to the next point. One of the consequences of this livery of Seisin ritual was that it gave rise to disputes, exactly like Joel said. It gave rise to disputes. One person said, wait a minute, this is a red rose. And this person, no, it was a white rose, right? Who gets to resolve these disputes? This was also one of the first movers of courts, right? This was one of the first movers of courts. The idea of a court that we have today was not really known. I mean, I discussed this in the post for today, but this is Magna Carta. Magna Carta is the Great Charter, which just celebrated its 800th birthday in the year 1215. Actually, did anyone see the exhibit at the Museum of History a couple of years ago? Yeah, I took my class on a field trip a couple of years ago. They actually had a copy of Magna Carta, which was at the museum by the medical center. It was a ripoff. It wasn't one of the original ones. It was from 1217, but it was close enough. There's only about 4 or 5 copies of the actual 1215 Magna Carta left in the world. But one of the provisions of Magna Carta was to ensure what we now know as due process of law. You'll study in constitutional law this idea of due process of law. That stretches all the way back to Magna Carta. One of the provisions of Magna Carta said you cannot be deprived of your property except by the judgment of your peers or the law of the land. You cannot be deprived of your property except by the judgment of your peers or by the law of the land. Law of the land became a synonym for due process of law. That before property is taken away from you, you have to have a hearing. You get a jury. You get some sort of process. And this entire idea of Seisin required courts. Was a person, in fact, complying with their duties? Because what if someone said, wait a minute, I'm kicking you off your land. You didn't do what you're supposed to do. You didn't fart loud enough, right? Okay, then that goes to a court. Goes to a judge. And you actually had the king's courts, which would travel around the countryside and resolve these disputes. And in case you're curious of the history, there were king's courts, and then there were basically the courts of Ecclesiastes, the religious courts, and the other common law courts, right? These were the judges of the law, right? You have the king's courts were powers of equity, and you have the common law courts of law. This is why we have law and equity, these 2 branches, right? You have the king's religious courts, and you have the common law courts. They would actually compete with each other for jurisdiction. Who would have power over a certain matter? There's this lengthy history, right? So much of what we have today between law and equity stems from who farted louder, right? This is where all this stuff began. The history is fascinating. I mean, this is why our legal system is so complicated. It's why you need 3 years of law school because of all this history. But one of the points was you now had to have a system of neutral judges who would decide, was in fact the livery of Seisin proper? Did they comply with the terms of the agreement? There's evidence, right? There's testimony. There are all these procedures which came about for this purpose. Okay? There weren't really courts for criminal matters. You'd be executed if the king accused you of something, right? If two people had a dispute, they had trial by combat. You know what that means? They would fight to the death. Yes, in fact, if two people had a dispute, much like dueling, they would just fight each other. That was actually considered a valid form of cross-examination, right? I'm serious. It was called trial by combat. That's where it came from. This was considered a fairly valid form of dispute resolution. It's called alternative dispute resolution, if you will. A little bloody, but it worked. And by the way, they wouldn't actually fight themselves. They would actually hire knights to fight on their behalf. This is where knights jousting comes from. Oh, what, combat? The reason why knights were jousting was because their masters got into a fight, and they would hire these knights to, kill each other, and whoever won resolved the dispute. You wonder where things come from, right? There's virtually everything you study in history has a legal reason behind it. You have no idea. I'll try and, if I remember, to tell you these things, but there's so much legal aspects of everything that we do. Okay. All right, so any questions on that? Nothing? Okay. So now that this history, I think, makes sense to you. I hope at least. If it doesn't, you can come talk about it afterwards. But now that this history makes sense, I'd like to introduce the concept that we'll be spending the next 5 or 6 weeks on. And this is something called an estate. Okay? An estate. In order to understand an estate, okay, so first of all, when I say estate, usually the first thing law students think of, and this is without fail, is that's the property my grandma had when she died, right? It's her estate. Yeah? That's what most people think of. I want you to eliminate that definition from your head because it's wrong. Okay? That's how the phrase is often used in common vocabulary, but that's not what the phrase means here. Okay? Estate describes a relationship between a person and a piece of property. Describes a relationship between a person and property. Whenever I ask you, what is this person's estate? What I want you to tell me is what is the relationship between that person and a piece of property. Okay, that makes sense so far? Okay. And there are 2 questions to answer this relationship. Okay, the first question is who owns it? Right? Who owns it, right? Who is the person that actually owns this piece of property? The second question is where things get complicated. The second question is when do they own it? Because in order to establish what a relationship is between a person and a piece of property, it's not enough to simply know the name of the person who owns it. What you have to know is when do they own it. And let me give you an easy example that I mentioned last week. I'm sure most of you live in an apartment, or many of you do. I do. I don't own it, I rent it. Okay? I'm renting that apartment today. But a year ago, I wasn't living there. And when my lease runs up, and whenever it runs up, I may not live there in the future. Someone else may have already signed a lease to take my apartment after I'm done. So if we ask, who owns this apartment, right? Who owns this apartment? Well, you can say Josh at the moment, but that's not right because I don't own it. I'm renting from my landlord. And what if we say, well, what happens in 2017? Well, Josh is not there anymore. Bill owns it. And what if you said, who owns it in 2015? I wasn't there. Someone else owned it. Okay. You need to acculturate. You need to shape your mind to always be thinking of who owns it at the present moment and who owns it at some point in the future, right? Who owns it in the present, who has what's called a present interest, and who owns in the future, what's called a future interest. what makes this topic so frustrating for law students is that they have difficulty separating who owns it now and who owns it later. So whenever I ask you over the next 6 weeks, I hope this becomes second nature, right? What is Josh's estate, in this piece of property? You have to think about, well, Josh may own it now. Maybe he'll own it in 20 years. Maybe he'll own it when his father, when a relative passes away. Maybe he'll own it when something happens, when an event happens. Okay. We will discuss different instances where property shifts, but you always need to understand who owns it at any given time. That makes sense. Okay. Put those 2 questions very prominent in your notes, because I promise I'll ask them in next class, what's the person's estate? And I'll say, well, I don't know. Try and at least answer those 2 questions. Any questions before I move on? Okay. The second thing I'd like to do in your notes is to keep track of the types of estates. Okay. There are going to be, oh man, probably a dozen of these by the time we're done. We'll keep adding to this list, but we need to make certain that you understand each of the different types of estates. So now we'll start calling on people. This is probably the longest I'll lecture the entire semester. I apologize. I don't like doing it, but this history goes better. Where did I finish last time? Yes, sir. That's Jamie, right? Jaime. Thank you, sir. Okay, Jaime. Tell me, what is a fee simple? What does that mean, fee simple? Describe that for me. And as describing it, do what I just said. Answer the 2 questions which I just posed to you.
I believe, if I read it right, it's the most absolute of rights of the bundle.
You're even not doing what I said. Answer the 2 questions that I posed. So, I'm telling you, if you answer these 2 questions, you won't go awry. Just answer the 2 questions. So describe, what does it mean if I say Josh has fee simple?
You have fee simple, it means that you have presently the most absolute rights to the property. You can sell it, you can transfer it.
Okay, so who owns it? Josh, right? When do I own it?
Right now.
Right now, for how long?
Forever.
Am I immortal?
Until you die or give it
Whoa, whoa, whoa. So wait a minute. How can I own something forever if I die? I mean, all men are mortal, right? Socrates. I'm going to die. How can I own something forever then? Oh, wow. You have any tips, fountain of youth? I don't know.
Well, you can give it away to someone, or it can be part.
Sean, what do you think? So Jaime's right? With the fee simple, right? We'll just say Josh owns it forever. I mean, as a practical matter, he's exactly right. Fee simple means you have the ownership forever. But we are all mortal. All men are mortal, right? Socrates is mortal. How can it be, right? What does that mean to own something forever?
Maybe like after you die, it goes to one of your heirs.
Oh, okay. Exactly right. And this is where feudalism comes into play. None of us can live forever. It's impossible, right? We only live once. YOLO. So what happens when we die? What happens when we die? So under the olden days, in the Dark Ages, when a person died, the land would go back to the Lord. When a person died in the Dark Ages, the land would go back to the Lord. The great innovation of the English property system was that after a person died, the land would stay in their family. The land would go to their heirs. The land would go to their heirs. Everyone makes sense? So for the fee simple, right? We can say it like this. Instead of saying Josh owns it forever, we'll say Josh has, by the way, I'll give you a law school rite of passage. Blackacre. Okay? Hope you were smiling. For reasons that we no longer know, we don't know. The reasons are lost to the sands of time. Law schools have always described a fictional place as Blackacre. And there's also Whiteacre. Okay? These are not real places, but they're fictional examples been used for hundreds of years in law studies. So I will use Blackacre and Whiteacre interchangeably. These are not real places, but the best explanation I've seen is that these are different types of beans, or black beans and white beans, whatever. But there's Blackacre and Whiteacre. So if I say that Josh has Blackacres, and when Josh dies, it goes to Josh's heirs. Right, Josh owns Blackacre, and when Josh dies, it goes to Josh's heirs. Right, Varvara, what do you think about that? Does that accomplish what we want to accomplish? Does that make sense? What does that actually accomplish? Explain what I just wrote like a dozen words on the board, right? What does it actually accomplish?
Doesn't it accomplish that the land? I mean, kind of what the king wanted. Like, if the land stays with the families and it makes them stay put.
Good. So it says Josh has it, and when Josh dies, it goes to his heirs. Everyone get that, right? But Lindsay, what happens if Josh? I'm like, my kids are a bunch of ingrates. I don't like them. I'm gonna sell it to Bill. You know what? Screw my kids. I don't care. They're a bunch of like low lives. They don't take care of me. Can I do that?
Yes.
Why can I do that?
Because they don't have an interest
Yes.
in until you die.
Exactly right. Okay, exactly right. So we have to ask the question here, right? Who owns it? Well, there's really two people. There's a present interest for Josh, and there's a future interest for Josh's heirs. That's exactly what Lindsay said. In the present, right now, Josh has the interest. He owns it. But at some point in the future, my heirs have it, right? So we say today that my heirs have a future interest. Jacqueline, when do my heirs get it? When does their future interest kick in?
When you
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful thought, right? When I die, my present interest disappears. I'm dead. I can't own anything, right? When I die, my present interest disappears, and the future interest of my heirs becomes present. I say it like this, right? When Josh dies, I'm sure you're all eager for that, right? The heir's future interest becomes present, right? The future interest becomes a present interest. And you see, this is why these two questions are so complicated. Depending at what point in time you're asking about, the same, when there's an intervening event, which is almost always death, it could be other things, but when there's some sort of death, the ownership shifts. Have with me so far. Now, Landon. Now again, what happens if I'm a jerk? What happens if I don't like my kids, right? Right? I like you. You're a cool guy, right? Can I sell my land to you during my life? Okay, good. So what happens if, let's use another example. Josh sells Blackacre to Landon, right? And I make you, deliver me a red rose every year. It's beautiful, right? What happens to my heirs? They get nothing, right? They get nothing. If I sell it to Landon, let's do it like this. The present interest is Landon, and then Landon, who has a future interest? Whose heirs?
Mine now.
Your heirs. Okay? The future interest is Landon's heirs. I cut my kids out of the loop. I cut them out. They're out. By selling it to Landon, now it's for the rest of his life, and when he dies, to his heirs. This was the magic of the fee simple. This was the revolution of the fee simple. It made it so that you did not need to keep it in your bloodline. You can now, during your life, transfer property to someone else. And then it would go to that person's bloodline. There was no requirement with the fee simple to keep it in your family. You could cut out your worthless heirs, right? You could transfer land. And what happens? Maybe Landon at Whiteacre, I have Blackacre, we swapped. Maybe I really wanted that piece of land. The fee simple made property alienable. Alienable, I'm sure you've seen this word. Alienable means you can transfer, right? Rather than keeping land locked down in a bloodline for centuries, which is really not very efficient, The fee simple, right? The idea that you own something absolutely allowed the transfer and allowed a market economy to flourish. It was perhaps one of the greatest inventions of the Middle Ages. Right? Printing press was great, but I think the fee simple is more important. I mean, it was. It liberated more people than books would for quite some time. They won't get this. The fee simple allowed people to transfer or to alienate land during their lives and did not keep it tied to a bloodline. Questions? Questions on that? Okay. So now I want to go up, and I wrote this, right? I wrote the sentence. Josh owns Blackacre, and when Josh dies, it goes to Josh's heirs. Okay? This is a very cumbersome way of writing it. It's a very difficult way of writing it. So lawyers, as they always do, like to standardize things. They like to set a specific terminology that everyone will understand. You know, call them magic words, right? Certain magic words make it very clear. So I want to write this sentence, right? Blackacre to Josh and his heirs. Blackacre to Josh and his heirs. Believe it or not, these few words answer the exact question they want you to answer. These few words describe who owns a property and when they own the property. Lawyers 800 years ago decided how even today we will decide the words of transferring property. If you ever read a deed, which you'll do in property too, there's all these really complicated and big old-sounding words. Why are they there? Because 700 years ago, some lawyer said, I think this is how we should phrase it. And then his student said, okay, I'll do it the same way. And his student said, okay, let's do it the same way. And then his great-grandson said, you know what? Grandpa did it this way. Let's not screw it up. Let's keep it the same way. So language has basically stagnated for the last 800 years. I'm only slightly exaggerating. So let's break this down very carefully. Blackacre to Josh and his heirs, right? So why don't you explain the two questions. Who own it and when do they own it, right? Who has the present interest and who has the future interest? Okay. So hold on, that's Graham? Yes, sir. Graham, so who owns it now? Who has the present interest of Blackacre?
Not anymore, right?
Yeah, no, we're using this example here.
Josh.
Yeah, okay. Josh, right? Josh has a present interest. And Graham, how long will that last for? Yeah, for my until I die, right? I am not immortal. I will die eventually. I cannot hold property from the great beyond. When I die, I no longer have it. Now, Cameron, at the present moment, who has the future interest right now? I'm still alive. I'm here. I'm teaching. My heirs, right? Okay. Okay. So Josh's heirs has a future interest. Now, this is actually going to blow you away, right? Well, that's Natalie. So Natalie, let me ask you a question. Let's say I have two sons, right? I know. Let's say I have two sons, right today. Are they my heirs? Okay. What happens if one of my sons dies before me? Is he still my heir? No. When do you determine, Natalie, if this person actually has heirs? When will be calculated who my heirs are? I'm saying I have two sons today. One of them dies tomorrow, gets hit by a bus. The other son dies a year later, you know, whatever. This class has lots of violent deaths. There'll be lots of them. Natalie, when are heirs calculated? When are heirs determined? How do I know who my heirs are? When do you figure that out? No. I'm telling you, my kids die before me. Can someone who's dead inherit any money? If my son dies today, will he get anything when I die? No, he can't. He's dead. So when are my heirs calculated, Natalie? When I die, right? You only figure out who the heirs are. You only figure out who the heirs are when I die. As morbid as that is, right? When I die, that's when my heirs are calculated. So this group of heirs, it's uncertain who they are. Right? I don't know who my heirs will be. Maybe I'll die without any heirs. Maybe my entire family will be wiped out by the bubonic plague or whatever, right? You want to talk about property law during the Black Death and bubonic plague? This was when most of these laws figured out, because like who are the heirs? They have to figure this stuff out. So, but at the present moment, my heirs, whoever they happen to be, have a future interest, right? All right, now Elizabeth, right? Okay, so now I die, right? Josh dies. Who has the present interest? Yeah, but are they heirs anymore, right? Who are they? Yeah. So the present interest go to Josh's heirs. Elizabeth, who has the future interest? Exactly. Exactly right. The future interest goes to the heirs of the heirs. And you see how this can keep going on indefinitely, right? This is how land would often stay in the same family. Except if I decide to sell my land to someone else. When I gave it to Landon, that cut my heirs out of the loop. They're gone. They're out of the loop. They cut the heirs out of the loop. Okay. So when you look actually at this expression, there are two components, right? To Josh, right? 1 second, Melody, Madison. To Josh, that's defining the present interest, and its heirs defining the future interest, right? You have to study these words very carefully because it gets a lot complicated, and the choice of words can radically alter the nature of the transaction. Yes, Madison?
On when you die.
Yes. I should use someone else next time I teach this, but that was a bad example. But yeah, go for it. Yeah. Of the heirs. Yes, ma'am. Yes, so the heirs of Josh's heirs, right? And it gets complicated if there are multiple heirs. It gets very complicated very quickly, but keep it simple for now. Everyone get this so far? It'll get more complicated fairly rapidly. Why don't you make sure you get this? Yes, Norma. I sold it, yeah.
You sold it to Landon. Okay, so.
Gifting is slightly different, so let's say selling it.
Okay, so then I thought that you can only sell your present interest. And then
Oh,
the
very
future
good.
interest is not something that.
Norma, can I ask the question again? Do my heirs have anything until I die? And that's a key point. When you have the fee simple absolute, until I die, my heirs' interest is speculative, right? I can cut them out of the loop. Until I die, they may have some sort of future interest in it, but it doesn't come into play until I die. And I can cut them out. It's a very good question. Until I die, my heirs, think, oh, I can't wait till daddy goes away, right? But they got squat until then. Yes, sir, Landon.
So under this, without a will, the only way.
There are no wills. Okay, so one point to make clear: back then, these people were mostly literate, and there were not wills. They didn't have that. There was not even a sense to even, wills are a fairly recent invention. We'll talk about wills later in this class, but for purpose of this discussion, everything was done strictly with these grants at the time of life, and there's actually a tax reason for there as well. Wills were taxed. Right, every transaction of the will was taxed. So if you could decide at one point how land will be disposed of after you die, you pay less taxes. Yeah, go ahead, please.
So the only way to, I guess, transfer the future interest would be to sell your present interest.
I'm sorry. Start again. I think I missed what you said.
Your kids to have the future interest anymore. The only way
you cut them out.
Stop that from happening would be to sell your present.
Right. So if you have fee simple, and you want to cut your kids out of the loop, you would give the fee simple to Landon or someone else. And by doing that, you cut your kids out. Their future interest goes away. And again, Norma's question is exactly right. Your future interest does not materialize until the father dies. right? There's no interest. It's all speculative or some, it's contingent. It doesn't have to happen. You can be cut out. There's no guarantee you get it. Because again, what happens if, I have one son? He's like, oh man, I can't wait till daddy dies to get Blackacre, right? And then the son dies. He gets nothing. His heirs get nothing. You only calculate this at the time of death. And there's also another point. Right, so if your grandmother says, Johnny, you're gonna be my heir. It's like, well, not quite yet, grandma. You're my heir. No, not yet, grandma. Yeah, hope that doesn't happen for a while. Everyone with me so far. Everyone get that? I know this is complicated. So the framing, right? The framing you have to understand is this: Blackacre to Josh and his heirs. I realize I'm dwelling on this language for a long time, but you need to know how these words work. Blackacre describes the property, to Josh describes the present interest, and his heirs describes the future interest. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
So if you're the owner and then you've got a son and then that son has a son, but your son dies.
Yeah.
Your grandson, are they not an heir?
Yes, a grandson can be an heir. There's actually a fairly elaborate, complex formula to calculate heirs. You start with, interestingly enough, your spouse is not quite as, because not of the blood, but your kids, your heirs, their grandkids, their nephews, their nieces. It can go very far. There's actually a footnote in the book of a story. There's a guy from New York, from Staten Island, from where I'm from. He died a couple years ago at the age of 97 or so. He was a survivor of the Holocaust. And basically his entire family was wiped out. He had no heirs. And he left an estate of several $1 million. He was fairly wealthy. He had no heirs. They could not find anything. In the event that no heirs are found, there's a process called eshiat. People say escheat, but I think it's pronounced eshiat. That's how you say it, eshiat. When you die with no heirs, your property goes to the state. When you die without any heirs, it eshiats to the state. The state keeps the money, and I'm not quite sure what they do with it, but I'm sure it's put to a bad purpose. Yeah. Was that?
They hold on to it for you.
Well, you're already,
If
you're dead though.
if an heir comes up,
Yeah.
they'll give it to
Have you dealt with this before? Really? Tell us about it.
you. I work for Occidental Petroleum, so if we had a royalty payment,
Ah.
that we couldn't contact the landowner. We were sending them checks and they kept coming back, so they died. We eschewed it to the state of Texas, and then they would take care of it from there.
Do you know if people ever claimed it?
I doubt it.
Well, the interesting part is when this guy died, all these people came out of the woodwork and say, "Grandpa," When there's money to be had, people try to feign a relationship. So a hand over there.
I was just going to add on that I actually have some experience with what he does, and basically the state holds it for 5 years before they actually just take it.
Yeah, I think it goes to the treasury at some point of the state. But yeah. So going back though, a good question. Under your lists of types of estates, right? What you need to be able to know is that fee simple is represented by words to A and his heirs. Okay. You need to become fluent in reading estate language. This is the most frustrating part of this topic. You need to become fluent. If you see something that says to A and his heirs, you need to know that means fee simple. When you see something that says to A and his heirs, you have to know that means fee simple. All right? To A and his heirs, that means fee simple. The book describes that you can also call it the fee simple absolute. Don't call it that. Trust me, it will make you complicate it another week. Just call it a fee simple. You'll know what it means. Adding additional words makes it even more complicated because there's this fee simple determinable. There are a lot of different types of fee simple. Don't make it more complicated than you have to. So simply call it a fee simple. And when you see the language to A and his heirs, you know that's a fee simple. You know that's a fee simple, and that the person can dispose of it as he wishes, and it goes on in his family if he wants, or if not, he cuts out his heirs. He can do whatever he wishes. Okay. The book also mentions, under some common law rulings, if you just simply say to A, Period. That is a fee simple. That is technically right, but for purposes of my class and for my exam, which I'm sure you care most about, I will always say to A and his heirs, I will not try to confuse you more because there's actually conflicting rules about how it works if you omit the words and his heirs. At some points, it was a life estate. At some points, fee simple. I have enough I can confuse you on. I'll confuse you on other stuff that's more important. So for now, to A and his heirs means fee simple. Understood? Questions? Yes, ma'am.
What the note said to a forever, is that synonymous or is that?
I'm not going to use that phrasing, right? So again, one of the consequences of this doctrine developing over hundreds of years is that different lawyers use different phrasings to mean the exact same thing. This is the 99% accepted rate, right? This is what almost everyone understands to be a fee simple. There are alternatives which I'm not too concerned about. Okay. Questions? Okay, very good. The second type of estate, which was we discussed it last week with the painting. So is that Jesus? Jesus, do you remember last week we did a case for the painting? Do you remember where the father said, I want to give you this painting on your 21st birthday, but I'm going to keep it in my house for now. When I die, you get it, right? Do you remember how the court ruled that you can give a present now for something that only kicks in after death? Remember how the court approached that? Well, it wasn't testamentary, right? What's interesting is in the case of, you're exactly right. Usually a testamentary gift is a gift that kicks in after the person dies. But remember how the court understood the gift that the father gave? It wasn't testamentary. There was no will. There was no signatures, right? Yes, exactly right. We discussed this idea of the inter vivos gift, right? The gift during life. But what made that case difficult, is that Christian? What made that case difficult was, even though it was a gift made during life, the boy, the son, didn't get till the father died. Do you remember how the court understood that? How did the court reconcile that? How did the court reconcile the fact that it was a gift given during life, which it was, but the boy didn't get the thing until after his father died?
Didn't they say that given in the future?
Yes, bingo, exactly. Very good. We discussed this last week, and you probably didn't fully appreciate it until you came to class today. But it's conceivable to take a specific piece of property and chop it up, right? Remember we talked about the bundle of sticks, right? Even though the painting is one item and you can't literally chop it in half, you have a present interest and you have a future interest, right? The father kept the present interest and the son kept the future interest. Okay, now, and this is the important point, is that Jimmy, after the father wrote that letter to his son saying, I promise you, son, after I die, I'm going to give it to you, right? Could the father then cut the son out and give it to his wife? Could he?
Well, it depends on if you look at it as a gift or if it's part of his.
Jimmy, let me ask you a question like this, right? At the outset, right, the father owned the painting free and clear, right? How would you describe the father's estate at the outset? Who wrote this letter? In terms of, right? What kind of estate did the father have in the painting?
Yeah.
Exactly right. The father had a fee simple. Everyone get that, right? He had it absolute. Okay? Jimmy, what did the father do after that letter? Did he still have a fee simple? This is the important insight. After the father wrote this letter, did he still have a fee simple? No, what do you think? Is that Kemi? After the father wrote the letter, did he still have a fee simple? What do you think? Why would you say yes? But who has the future interest? The son. Was it his heirs or his son? Ah, so you see the difference, right? This wasn't left some sort of generic heirs, whoever they may be. He named the person. He named the person, the son. So Kemi, in this case, right, who had the present interest in the painting? And who had the future interest? Yeah, whatever the son's name is. I don't remember. Whatever the son's name was, I don't remember, right? Now, here's the tricky part. Is that Christine? Christine, what happens if the son had died and the son died in a horrible plane accident, right? And he had a son. No. See, here's the key point. The father started with a fee simple. But once he wrote that letter, right, he only reserved for himself a present interest. He gave away his future interest. He gave away the future interest and he could not get it back. Once the father wrote that letter, his present interest was all he had. And when he died, the painting would definitely go to the son or the son's heirs. Okay? We say that the father retained what's called a life estate. The father retained what's called a life estate. Imagine he chopped up his fee simple, chopped it up, chopped, right? And he took out for himself only one stick in the bundle for the rest of his life. Who gets the remainder? Who gets everything else? The son. He chopped up his fee simple into a life estate, and the son got the remainder. The son got everything that's left over. Everyone understand that? Once he wrote that letter to his son, he no longer could claim it back. Okay? So the second type of estate, which was referenced in the reading somewhat obliquely, but I'll make it clearer now, is what's called the life estate. The life estate. Okay? The life estate looks something like this. To A for life, then to B and his heirs. To A for life, and then to B and his heirs. So imagine this in terms of the painting, right? The father said, okay, I'll write it out. From father to father for life, then to son and his heirs. We'll say it like this. Wait, what the hell is that? What do you mean from father to father for life? How can the father give it to himself? This is the trickiest part of the life estate. At the outset, right? Father started with a fee simple. He started out with a fee simple. He owned the painting completely. He then chopped up his own estate. He chopped up his own interest. And he started with a fee simple, and he gave himself only a life estate, which lasts for the duration of his natural life. And at the conclusion of his natural life, it goes to B and his heirs, right? It goes to B and his heirs. Kenneth, what does this language to B and his heirs look like? What does that look like to you? What does that phrase to B and his heirs remind you of? Fee simple. This is why you need to know the vocabulary. Kenneth, finish it off. After A dies, what is B's interest? After A dies, what is B's interest? What estate does B have once A dies? Once it ends heirs? You said it. You already gave me the answer. You said it a minute ago. You said it right. After A dies, after the father dies, what is the son's interest? It says, and his heirs. Read left to right. You already said it. You said it a minute ago. What does the phrase, and his heirs mean? What does that tell you? Yes, so what is B's interest after the father dies? Just say it again. Yes! Yes, you said it. Do you understand why, though? So tell me why.
Well, so if A gave up his interest, B dies, then B would gain.
You're working way too hard, Kenneth. When you see the language B and his heirs, what does that tell you? Without knowing anything else. B and his heirs. Be simple. This is why you need to know the language. Kind of, you are on the exact right track with trying to think this through. But when you see the phrase "and his heirs," that tells you be simple. You need to memorize these words because they'll get more complicated. Yeah, Camp was doing the exact. He was trying to think like a law student. Memorize, right? I will not say this for many things throughout this course, but this stuff you're gonna have to memorize. You're gonna need to know the words and what they mean. If you memorize the words, you'll be so much better off for the exam. If you try and rationalize and think it through, you'll drive yourself nuts. Trust me. Okay, you'll go crazy. So back up top to George. So we say in this example, right? What is the present interest here? Right? It says from father to father for life. What's the father's interest?
Life estate.
Exactly, right? Father has a life estate. How do we know this? Because it says from father to father for life. Don't try to get creative. It says to father for life. That means there's a life estate. We read left to right, read comma to comma, from father to father for life. Okay. What is, Matthew? Sir, tell me, what is the future interest here? Yes. And what's the son's interest? Okay. Now, I want to be very clear here. Does he have a fee simple today? At this moment, he does not have a fee simple. What do we call what he has today? This is the key point. I mentioned it briefly. What do we call the son's interest today? Anyone know it?
Is it non-freehold?
The remainder. I said it briefly. I didn't make it clear. Remainder. Okay? Son has remainder. And the way you think about this, right? You have this full, the full pie, right? This full pie. And the father carved out life estate. The son gets everything left over, right? Remember division, remember in grade school? The remainder, whatever is left over. The son has remainder. But Matthew, to finish this up. Once the father dies, what will the estate be of the son? Exactly. So we say he has a remainder in fee simple. This is where it gets tricky, right? You're describing at some point in the future what he'll have. At the present moment, it's a remainder, but it's a remainder in fee simple. Because once the father dies, the son gets it entirely. The son gets everything. Or if the son's not alive, it goes to the son's heirs. The son's heirs get it. But it's no longer in the possession of the father. Once the father wrote this letter, it's out of his hands, and it goes to the son and his heirs indefinitely. Yes, sir.
So if the son died before the father, like he had no heirs, what is she to the state?
Okay, so law students love asking it to Eshiat. They love it. It will never happen. Okay? Unless I give an exam where there's a zombie apocalypse and everyone's dead. No, I think I did that once. Where there's person has no heirs. I want you to assume that everyone will have heirs. Understand? Assume that everyone will have heirs at some point. Everyone in this room has an heir somewhere. You can find them. So seriously, unless the example is like there's some sort of mass epidemic or a zombie apocalypse, assume in my exam that everyone has an heir. Okay? The answer will almost certainly not be Eshiat. Every year people love the Eshiat. I don't know why. That's not going to be the right answer. Okay? Because that makes it too easy. Because there's Eshiat, you don't have to do any work. Yeah. Mass, I'm sorry. Please, I'm with stupid. No, which one is it?
So if he had left it to his son rather than to his son and his heirs,
Oh.
then it wouldn't be feasible.
No. You're making it more complicated than it needs to be, but the short answer is was there I think actually the first question I do it does it. I'll do that in a second. Does anyone else have a question before I get to it? Yes.
So to the question who owns it today, I will have to say father for life or
say present interest, father for life.
Present interest and remainder for the son? I mean,
yeah, the answer is exactly right here. If I ask you, what is the estate of Blackacre, right? Or what does he say of the painting? You'd say, well, the present interest is the father has a life estate.
Mm-hmm.
And for future interest, the son has a remainder in fee simple. Sorry, I forgot to write son. But the son has remainder in fee simple. You answer the question like this, I'll be very happy. Yes, sir.
So when the father writes that letter, he then creates the life estate, and the son will have fee simple in the future.
The remainder in fee simple, yes.
The son dies before the father does. Does the father
be simple again?
No, because it's to the son and his heirs, right?
Well, that's what I meant. The son, the father.
Oh, you're asking would the father be the heir of the son? Actually, quite possibly the father may be the son's heir, but usually it goes down, not up, right? Usually, if this was a grandson, the picture, the grandson will get everything, right? You only go up if there really is no one else.
Yeah. So if the son dies before he has a grandson, has his own son, then we'll go back to the father.
That's not the good answer, but that's possible. Other questions? I want to do Madison's questions. If you turn to page 219, please, in your books. I want to walk through these questions yeah, again, I think I said this before, but in the next couple units, there'll be a lot of questions. Try to work these out yourself. So let's look at question number 2. You want to read it? Is that James? Read question number 2, please.
In 1600, O conveys Whiteacre to A for life, remainder to the heirs of B. B is alive in 1600 but dies without a will soon thereafter. B's heirs C. Subsequently, A dies. What state does C have?
All right, James. So let's walk through this. This is somewhat Melody's question, but not. I'm sorry, Madison's question, but not exactly. So, James. So it says O conveys Whiteacre to A for life, and remainder to the heirs of B. Okay. So what is the present interest here? Let's start practicing going through these sorts of things.
So, B simple.
Does A have a fee simple?
I'm sorry, life estate.
Yes, sir. The present interest we say is A has a life estate. Okay. Okay, yeah, finish it up good. So, and what's the future interest? Is it to B? Yes, sir. So for a present interest, we say that A is a life estate. And for the future interest, we say that the heirs of B have remainder in fee simple. Okay. Forget about the 1600 part. That's not too important, right? All right. So Anna, I'm sorry, Kaylee. Okay. Okay. A dies, right? What happens when A dies? Right. Okay. So, okay, let's try this one more time. B dies, right? Okay. B dies. When B dies, what do we calculate when B dies? What do we only know when B dies? When is a person's heirs calculated? A few minutes ago. When? Exactly. So when B dies, what do we now know? And who is his heir? Okay. So we now know that the heirs of B are C. So let me ask the same question to you, Kay. Who has the future interest? What's the future interest here? A's still alive. A still has a life estate. But who has the future interest? Who has it? Exactly. C has the remainder, and what type of estate is it? Beautiful, perfect. At that moment, right, once B dies, we say that C has a remainder in fee simple. We say that C has remainder in fee simple. Yes, ma'am.
So you said when A is still alive, the future interest is C, the remainder.
Well, the thing is, we don't know the heirs until B dies. So we have to wait till B dies to figure out who has the interest. We just say the heirs, but that's not specific enough. But once B's dead, then we can calculate the person's heirs. Yes, sir.
Just so I'm clear, B never actually had any interest in this.
No.
His heirs did.
His heirs did, exactly. He had no interest whatsoever. Madison, to answer your question somewhat?
Yes, I guess I'm just confused about remainder and fee simple.
it's a remainder in fee simple. What that means is at the present moment, you have a remainder, right? That's your interest. But once everything goes according to plan, everyone drops dead as they will, your future interest becomes a present interest in fee simple, right? So if you go back to the notes here, you're effectively describing today what someone will have tomorrow. Today they have a remainder in fee simple. When the death happens, that future interest becomes a present interest, and you have fee simple, period. Questions? All right. So let me wrap up a little bit and summarize. Again, what's going to make this class and this topic drive you batty is the terminology. And I didn't mean to pick on Kenneth before, but he got the right answer, and then he tried overthinking it. I think some of the back did the same. Look at the words and read left to right. If it says to A and his heirs, you need in your brain to think, oh my God, that means fee simple, right? That's it. A has fee simple. He can do whatever he wants with it. When you see something that says to A for life, then to B and his heirs, you think, okay, A has a life estate. A can only use it during his life. He can't do anything after his life, right? If he sells it now, it doesn't even matter. When he dies, it goes to his heirs. For future interest, B has a future interest. We call that a remainder. B has a remainder in fee simple. You need to remember the names that we give to the different present interests and the different future interests. So far we have a life estate and a present fee simple. In terms of what the future interest is, we've done what's called a remainder. There will be about 12 of these terms that you have to memorize. If you fall off the wagon in week 1 and you don't do the reading carefully, nothing will make sense in 3 weeks. So I implore you, I don't say this very often, but I implore you, if you do the reading for next week and it doesn't make sense, read it a second time. It's not very long. Seriously, if you don't catch along now, you will be left behind in the next couple weeks. Okay, any questions? No? All right, I will see you all on Thursday. Thank you very much.